going from where we left off. So what we want to do now is we want to add some texture to these this rock and this ground plane. So what I'll do is I'll open up Photoshop and I'm going to navigate. I'm just using Bridge here. You can just use the regular file method that you want. All right, so first I'm going to look at my rock, and I've got the layered PSD here, and I've written out all these files. So let's just open this layered PSD and take a look at it. All right, so this is my original texture file that I got from textures.com, which I'm a subscriber there. So this is actually already tiling. So if I click on this background image here and I go to filter, other, offset, you can see as I'm moving through this offset, it's actually tiling, which is, you want this to happen. So if you don't have a tiling image, you need to go make one. And I've gone over before how to make a tile image, so we won't do that right now. Okay, so we have this background color, and the issue is there's baked lighting information in this diffuse color. We do not want that at all. We want it to be completely flat and color only, because all these dark areas is light contribution or shadow contribution. So let's look at the one that I had made before. So this is the diffuse. This is actually not great. So let's redo it. So I'm going to take this background and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm just going to delete this old diffuse that I had. Make a new folder, diffuse. Take this new copied background that I have here. And I'm going to go up to Image, Adjustment, and Shadows and Highlight. Actually, let me zoom in a little bit first, then do it. That way I can kind of keep a better eye of what's going on. All right, so I'm just going to start dragging some of these settings around. What I'm trying to do is kind of just trying to get rid of those little shadows that are at least the biggest shadow areas, the most egregious ones. So if you hit this preview, you can turn it on and off and see what it's doing. Down some of these highlights. And the diffuse pass is going to look weird. You're just going to have to get used to that idea. It's gonna look pretty weird. I mean, you want some information in there. But really, you just want to get rid of as much shadow information as you can. So just mess around with this a little bit. Right, until you get a good, and this will take some trial and error to kind of figure out where you think is a good spot for it. All right, let's take a look at that. There's still some shadow information in there. So what I'm gonna do, might have lost a little bit too much detail, but let's try to see what we can do with some levels. All right, let's go into levels. Down. Really just trying to get rid of those shadow levels. One thing that you could do is in those dark areas, I could click on this object or click on this layer, go to select, color range, kind of get those darkest areas. And I just made okay, so I did a color range. I messed with the fuzziness level to try to get like kind of just what the dark areas of the image are. And then I'm going to create a new layer. actually what I could do is, well, let me just delete this layer. And since I have this selection still selected, whenever I make this levels, it's going to actually mask out that part. So let's see, it's actually masking out just those dark areas. I just get somewhere around there. Just want to knock it down a little bit. Okay. Now let me make another one. Do levels. And let me just make it a little bit crunchier. And then maybe take down the saturation just a little bit. And say we want to have like a little bit of a, we'll put a photo filter on there, like a warmer cast. So it's just a warm filter. You can do by color or by filter, which you've got like cooling filters, red. So I'll just try this orange. This is full, and then you can just change the density. So the rock is a little bit warmer. All right, so that's our original. And this is our diffuse color. So I tried to, so you can see like a lot of the shadow information is gone now. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's try to make the spec map for this. So I'm just gonna duplicate my diffuse, and we'll call this spec. And what I'll do is, don't need that photo filter, just turn that off. And I'm going to use this hue saturation that I already had and just turn down the saturation so that it's black and white. Then I'm going to add a levels on top of that. And basically what this is going to be is telling you what areas are shiny and what areas are not. And you can always mess with these settings later as well. In the hypershade. Now I don't really know what I'm gonna get out of this, so one thing I need to do is I knock down those white areas, because I do not want, you do not want that white areas to be that white. So you just take it down a little bit. You just want some variation. Basically this is the white point and this is the black point. Probably take this too. Something like that. See if that'll work. All right, so we have our diffuse and a spec. And for this dirt control signal, I didn't flatten the image. I just left it how it was before, because I actually want kind of these crevice areas to act as like a dirt area. So what I did was I added a hue saturation, and then I did a levels, and I just really clamped it. So it's going to look like this from the beginning. And then I just took it way in. And what I'm trying to do is to just crunch out just those like kind of crevice areas to kind of add like a dirt multiplier into those areas. Okay. You can see dirt's going to collect in those black areas. And depending on how you have the mixer set up, you might just have to invert this. If you know, if black is going to be rock and white is going to be dirt, just depending on how it is. So, okay, that's pretty good. So we have our diffuse, we have a spec. This is our old spec. This one might work too. Yeah, I mean, you can just try different ones and see how it works, but we'll just delete that one. That was my old one. Okay. Over the dirt, and then this displacement. So how I made this displacement, so to have a broad, a mid, and a fine. So I took this original, I duplicated it, put it inside this displacement folder. And first I want to do is desaturate it. So I'm not using the layers because I just permanently want it to be black and white. All right, so I'm just going to do a levels. All right, and I just want it to be pretty crunchy because I'm really trying to call out these dark areas as the areas that go in and these white areas that are going out of the rock. So I'll try something like that. And this has to be pretty blurry. So because this is going to be the broad. So I only want kind of the biggest moves in shape on the broad. So I can even make this a little more intense. Okay. So this is my old broad and this is my new broad. And since I blurred this, it's no longer tiling because when it blurred over, the information from here to here changed because it didn't have relationship. So what you're going to have to do is go to filter. Really, it's only going to be that bad for the broad because it had the most blurring. So I'll go to other, offset, and you see that line there. It's let me just pull out my Wacom tablet real quick. Okay, so I have this vertical set at -1000. So I'll just keep that a whole number so I can remember easily what it is. And then set it to wrap around. You can see it's just offsetting the entire image I have selected by 1000 pixels down, vertical. So I'll hit OK. Now what I want to do is clone stamp that area. So I have some custom brushes here. That I like to use. Let's see, just like a grunge brush of some kind. You can find all kinds of different brushes online. I've just like gathered these over the years. These are just a small portion of the ones I have loaded, but there's a ton. So okay, let's see here, something that's a little bit grungy. And let's try this smoke. See how that is, because this is a pretty blurry image. So all right, so I'm just going to sample. Oops. Oh, it picked a different one. That again. All right, smoke. Here we go. All right, so I'll sample this area. And I'll make a new layer. And I am sampling all layers, not just the current layer or the below layer. I'm sampling every layer. That way, since this layer is blank, I need information to sample from. So I'm sampling from the entire document, which is really only this background copy here, but this is the way that I usually do it. All right, so then you just start painting. And it is actually a little bit too much edge to this. So honestly, another thing, I had too much scattering. So let me turn off scattering. Let's turn off shape dynamics and only have transfer. So this is a pretty blurry image, so we need to have a pretty blurry result. There we go, something like that. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, you just basically just want to get rid of the seam. So just work on that. Basically, I just went through a process like this on the previous one and just went through and got rid of that seam. So go through and do that for the vertical axis. And once you have this entire thing painted, what you'll want to do is you'll combine your paint layer and your original here. And you're just going to hit Control, select them both, and then hit Control E. And that just flattens those selected. Then you go back to filter, go to other, go back to offset and do plus 1,000. Because you need it to be exactly where it was before so that each layer of the texture line up properly. Because if you don't, then it's going to look weird. So it's just going to be offset incorrectly. All right, so go and do that same process for the V, the entire V, and then do it for the horizontal as well, which if you go back to offset, I'll turn this off to 0, and then I'll do 1,000 for this one. And you can see there's another line here. So I went and already did that. So I'm going to delete this and go to this broad. So this has already been painted. Okay, for the mid value, it's basically the same process. So I just take the background image again. I'll just get rid of that for a second. Go to adjustments, hue saturation, turn this down all the way. All right, and then I'm going to, let's crunch this value a little bit. Actually, let me blur it first. Just blur it. You just want a little bit blurred, because you just kind of want that mid-range detail so that it kind of gets rid of that really high frequency stuff. All right, and then what I want to do is add a levels, and I'm just going to make those levels a little more intense. I'm going to take down some of those really high highs. All right, so that looks pretty good. So this is going to be my new mid. I'll delete this one. My displacement mid. And then for the fine, it's actually different. So I'm going to take this background image again, duplicate it, put it up into this displacement folder. And what I want to do is go to image adjustments, hue saturation, lower saturation entirely. Then I'll go to filter, other, high pass. This high pass gives you a pretty good high frequency version of whatever your texture is. And every texture obviously is going to be different, so you're going to have to handle them all a little bit differently. So for this one, let's see. So there's no like formula really. You're just going to have to mess with it a little bit. One of the issues I see is that these white areas are going to be really high off in the displacement. So what I want to do is kind of knock down those white areas and then redistribute, so that, you know, you kind of just have to balance, because you need to realize that the black areas are bumping in and the white areas are bumping out. So you kind of, if the image is giving you too much white area, you need to just kind of knock it in a little bit. And then just, you know, just takes a little bit of practice to figure out what's going to do what. So I just want like kind of this really high frequency noise. All right, so once I have something I like, I just took that high end and I took the high pass layer and I took the adjustments layer that I did and I just combined them. So I'll call this fine. I'll get rid of this old one. And the new one I made is actually better than the other one I had, so I'll just delete that. And maybe I'll just add a little bit of noise to it. Just like a little bit of extra detail in there. See if that will give us something we like. All right, so we have the displacement fine, mid, and broad. And we have the dirt control, and we have the spec map, and we have the diffuse. Okay, so now let's save all these maps out. So I'll go to diffuse, and I'll just activate the first one, the diffuse. Go to save as. All right, we'll go to rock demo, source images, rock. And let's do demo. Just so that I can show you how I write all these out. So let's do rock, rough, diffuse. And you kind of want to keep the name convention the same for all of them. I'm just going to be using TIFF because for some reason I'm partial to it. just because it has, you can do 8-bit, you can do 16-bit, and it just has a like less compression than JPEGs. So you want to turn off layers because you want it to be a single layer copy. So because I have all these layers in here, it'll actually save those out. You do not want that. So do it as a copy, name it whatever your convention is, and then always add what that map actually is. So I just use diffuse for this one. All right, save, and I'll do, actually we'll just do no compression. All right, so for the next one, we do the same thing. Save as, if, we gotta go back into demo. Not layer, rock, rough, spec. All right, same thing. And then dirt control, let's do that next one. If rock layered dirt CTL. What CTL stands for control. And I just use that as a naming convention for myself. You can use whatever you want. All right, for the displacement, the first one is broad. So go in TIFF. Disp. Actually, just do disp broad like this. All right. Mid. Disp mid. No layers. And fine. If demo fine. All right. Am I here? Okay. All right, so let's set up, use these textures that we just made to texture this rock. So I'm gonna bring over my hypershade, and I'm gonna bring over my attributes. All right, so we have our rock material here, turn the weight up to 1, and we have the color. So I'm gonna hit the checkbox here, checker box, go to File for diffuse in the rock material. So you can see it attached to this file. And I will go to, let's, this project is set, rock demo. Yeah, then now it opens directly into the source images, how it's supposed to. All right, so we have, it's just my output window. We have the diffuse here. Okay, cool. So we have our first one set up. Let's name that rock, rough, diffuse, just so we can see it. And one thing you can do is you can cycle through, in the hypershade here, you can cycle through the naming conventions for these things by hitting 5 on the keyboard. So if I hit 5, it'll tell you what node, what the node is. And then this is blank. And then if you hit 5 again, it tells you what you've named that node. So you can just cycle through these if you want to, you know, just, if you usually just want to see what the name is. And then if you just want to know what the node actually is, you can hit 5 and it'll tell you that it is an AI standard surface or that it's a file or whatever. So I usually have it like this. Okay. And another thing you can do is 1 through 4 on the keyboard. What that will do is 1 will hide whatever selected node you have. It will like basically collapse that node. It still works exactly the same. It's just smaller. So if you hit 2, what that does is it only shows you the inputs and outputs that are currently being used in that node. So you can see in here, it's only base color and out color. If you hit 3, what that does is it shows you all of the outputs plus any of the inputs that are currently active. And then if you hit 4, it shows the entire node as it normally looks. Okay. Just to, and you can do that with any of these nodes. So 1, 2, and so you can see this place 2D node is hooked into all kinds of stuff. And then if you hit 3, it basically shows you every node that this thing has. Something like that. It's like, I think it's all the nodes that's being used plus its outputs. So, and then 4 is default again. Okay. So you can see, do it for any node. But if you're done with a node, you can just hit 1 and it just smashes it down, just so it's easier to manage. Something like that. Okay. Anyway, moving on. So I'm going to use this place 2D node for every other input that I have, all these other texture inputs that I'm using. So for the diffuse, the specular, for all my displacements, because I want them to be able to scale together. Because every time you import a new file, it's going to have its own place 2D node. So you'll have to manage every single one if you don't, use the same, what is it, 2D placement texture. Okay, so I'll click on this rock. Okay, first let's go over and see what is rendering now. So we will go to camera, render camera, and then turn on IPR. All right, cool. Let's go into my render cam. All right, you can see the rock texture is the only thing that's rendering right now. So if I go into my hypershader over here and I click isolate select. Now, if you remember what that does is it basically renders the only thing you have selected, but whatever you have selected has to be ran through the shader. Like if I select something that's not connected to a shader output, then it's not going to do anything. But say I want to see what the rock dirt mix is doing. It's doing that green rock mix. If I click just the rock material, then it's going to do just that rock material. And if I do the dirt, it's going to do just the dirt. Everything that's attached to that dirt. Okay. And then this luminance to see, what each one of those nodes is doing. And then if I hit rock diffuse, this is just the diffuse map that you're viewing. This is the shaded version of that. So you can see it's a little bit different. There's a little bit of shadow in there, but I mean, it's minimal, so it should be fine. All right. So next thing we want to do, I'll just turn that off, is we want to get specular color going. Here, let me pause the renderer. All right, so I'll go to the specular color file, rough spec. All right, now we have that plugged in. And what I was saying before is now, say we have these 2D place nodes. I want to use the same one, so I can delete this one. So now I have this one place 2D node driving both these texture files. That way, if I see, I'll start the render again. And I will isolate select and I'll click that. Now you can see I have both these textures. And if I, it's cycling back and forth, if I go to this 2D place node and I change its repeats to 2, well, let's see, 2. It scaled both of these together, which is exactly what you want. Or if I went to this 2D place node and I rotated the texture, both of them rotated together as well. Okay, so you want that to happen. All right, let's stop this. And let's name that real quick. rock, rough, spec. All right. Now, next thing we need to do is we need to add the displacement map into this rock. So let's go to the displacement shader here. Go to the, so we clicked on the AI mix shader shading group. So we'll go to that tab, shading group. And let's call this the rock dirt shading group. Just so we know exactly what it is. All right, in the displacement material section right here, we'll hit the checker box, go to File, and then it loads your displacement shader here. So we'll do rock dirt disp shader. All right, so you can see it's here. It's plugged into this. And then what we want to do is we want to go to the file for this. So you can see in the attribute editor, we have the rock displacement shader and the file input here. So I'll click this, go to this input or that file, open. Let's start with the broad. And we'll call this rock rough disp broad. It's just a really good habit to name everything properly, because whenever you go back in and you're trying to find stuff, if you didn't name everything, it's going to be a mess. So please do that. All right, so we're going to take this place 2D texture and we are going to input it into this rock rough displacement and then delete this old one. Actually, let's name this too. Let's do rock rough 2D texture place. Let's just do 2D placement. Okay, that way you can always know what it is. Okay, so now we have the displacement, we have the diffuse and the spec all plugged in. Now, if you remember, one thing that we need to do is we need to click on the actual object and we need to add Arnold Subdivisions to it so that it properly displaces. So I will click on this rock, which this is the transform node, and go to the shape node. And I'll go down to the Arnold tab, put that out, scroll down here, open up the subdivision and displacement attribute settings, and I will hit type as Cat Clark. And to show you what's happening, let's go to render debug shading and go to wireframe and then play that. Now you can see the wireframe, what it's actually rendering at. If I hit 0, it's still that smooth version, lower subdivision. If I start adding subdivisions, so this is 2, this is 3, so you can see it's starting adding. So the different types, so this is none, this is Cat Clark, and this is linear. I seem to get the best results with Cat Clark, actually. It's like the best algorithm. So I usually use that. So, and then your displacement attributes over here. So this is this height multiplier here is for the entire displacement set. You can actually go in. I don't usually modify this until the end. So what I want to do is modify each displacement individually. And if I want to globally change it later, I can, depending on like the size of the rock or something like that. Okay, that way you can use the same displacement signal for everything, but depending on how big that rock is, you can change the height globally for that in the actual shape of the object. A lot easier. Actually, I'll do an example of why this is important. So I will, because it's based off of size. One second. I'm going to click on this ground plane. And I'm going to add it to a layer because I just don't want to be selecting it right now. Hit ground, and then I'm just going to reference it so that I can only select that rock. The same thing we did with the camera HDR stuff. Okay. Now I'm going to take this rock and I'm going to Control D, duplicate it, and make a smaller version. And this has the same shader attached to it. So what happens whenever we scale? Okay, you can see that this object is a lot smaller, so it doesn't need the same amount of displacement, intensity, or iterations, because it's just a lot smaller of an object, so it doesn't need it. So I mean, if you do want to keep it the same height, that's fine. But say we just take it down a little bit, and then I even bring down the iterations, because the size is based on its on kind of its resolution. So actually, I guess keep that at 3 is probably okay. They just want to reduce it a little bit, just for like a consistency, across those objects. And probably you need to maintain 2 for the same amount of resolution, but we'll just keep that like that for now. All right. So let's go back to our render debug and go to basic, and that's basically just showing you displacement on a really simple background. I mean, on a really simple shader, just so you can see what's going on easier. So this little break right here is because of our seam in the file, or in that model. So that's my fault. So you just hide it, or if you're painting it by hand, you would just make sure that you paint out the seams, which that's a whole other thing to learn how to do. Okay, so let's go to render debug shading disabled. So basically, what that's going to do is it's just going to turn it back to the original shading model. So I'm going to pause the renderer, and you can see that it is mixing. I'm going to turn off the grid. What's that? Oh, it's up here. Display grid. All right, so the grid's gone. This 2D placement node, we'll call that dirt height placement, just so we know what that is. Because if we turn on, in the last video, we were talking about, let me go to perspective. If I raise and lower this thing, it's the amount, it's basically the dirt height of when it starts to mix into this rock. All right, so I hit stop. And now what we want to do is, let's make the dirt texture. So we actually have something. Now this is the same process that I went through with the rock texture, but I don't want to go and do that entire process again. You just go into Photoshop with your texture file that you have. I'm just going to use the ones that I've already made just to save time, because this video is already getting pretty long. All right, so let's go into the green texture, which is the dirt material, and I will go to color here, go to the checker, file, and I will go up into my mud directory because I'd already made that. So here's my diffuse for the mud, and its displacement and its spec. So here's my diffuse one. Load that. And let's render that. All right, so we already have some mixture going in there. This displacement for the rock is not what I want it to be yet. I just haven't touched it again. So let's turn this back on. And I just selected my dirt material. And the beauty, oh, I don't have any of my AOVs activated. So let me pause this and let's go into our display render settings. Go to AOVs and you'll see AOV groups, available AOVs, and active AOVs. So we have 0 active AOVs. And when I click on AI Shadow Matte, you'll have some available AOVs for it. And there'll be this built-in one as well, which is the one we're going to be using. So I'll go to built-in and it'll show me what's available, but I have to actually activate them, the ones that I want. So I will turn on diffuse direct, diffuse indirect, and I will turn on specular direct and specular indirect. So this little check, or this little arrow box, pushes them into active, and this one will push them back over. So, all right, for this circumstance, this is the only ones I'm going to use. So hit close. All right, let's run the IPR again. And it doesn't look like anything changed, but now we have the beauty, which is the final render. We have the diffuse direct, the diffuse indirect, specular indirect, or specular direct and specular indirect. So we don't have any specularity right now in these shaders. So I will click on this rock material. Let's open up the attributes here. And I'm going to turn the weight up, because we turned the weight down earlier in the last video. And then I will go do the same thing with the dirt, turn the weight up. And I definitely do not want it to be like that, but for now, this is, we just haven't plugged in everything yet. Okay, so let me pause it, the render, and we'll go over to specular for the dirt. So I'll click on the dirt material. And in the attribute editor, we'll go to the color, go to file. And we have the mud spec here. So I'll load that. And then very quickly, I'm going to also load the displacement shader for that. So let's click on that, go to file, and we will do the displacement mid value to begin. All right, so for these mud values, I want to do the same thing that I did with the rock value. So I want to connect all of these 2D place nodes into the same one. That way they all move together. All right, and I'll delete these. All right, so these are all moving together. Let's name this. So I'll call this mud 2D placement. And then I will call this the mud diffuse, mud spec, mud disp mid. All right, have everything named. Now, since we have displacement in our dirt material now, we need to add displacement to the ground plane so that it also has displacement. So if you remember earlier, we added this to a layer and we locked the layer. So we need to unlock it so we can select it. I'll select on the ground plane. We will go to the shape node. I'm going to delete the history on this because we had some history from earlier. Okay, so we just have the ground plane transform node, the shape node, this is the layer that it's inside of, and this is the material. So we'll go to the ground plane shape node, and like before, you go to and open up this Arnold tab, go to down to subdivision, displacement attributes, turn on Cat Clark. Let's do iterations of 3. Okay. And let's restart, update that scene. All right, and that went completely bananas. So for the height, let's do 0.1. See what that does. We need to render, update full scene. All right, we got some craziness going on there. Let's do 0.05. And with displacement, you need to update the full scene until, because whenever it needs to recalculate the displacement. So if you want to change this to height, you need to just update the whole thing. So 0.02, it's just like a way that it calculates. I don't know. All right, so we have dirt, We have displacement on the dirt, and we have dirt on these rocks as well. So all right. So let's fix this rock a little bit. I'm not really happy with the way the displacement's looking on that one. So I'm going to go into the rock displacement broad here. And let's make an AI range node for this. So what I just did was I used a crop region. That way it'll only render like a small area of the render when I have this active. Just so that it you know, doesn't have to render all this other stuff that I'm not worried about right now. Even like a little section of it is fine. That will give you more CPU power. It'll basically, instead of trying to render this entire frame, like your computer is trying to render every single pixel in this section, it's only rendering the region that you have selected whenever you have this active. To turn it off, you just click it off. Just like that. All right, and then just redraw it with left click when you turn it back on. All right, so go to this rock rough displacement broad, and I'm gonna hit tab. Select just the back. Hit tab, and then what we want is an AI range node. A range node is basically just levels like Photoshop. So I'm gonna take the out color and put it into the input, because this AI range node needs an RGB value. And you can see the out alpha is going out in displacement because it needs a single channel map. So what we'll do is we really do need that. So what we'll first do is name this range. So we'll call this rock rough levels, because that's really what it is. That's the way that I think of it anyway. And then what we need to do is convert this to luminance. So we will make a luminance node, because remember, this is RGB values, so we need to convert it down into single channel grayscale. So we take the out color of this levels, we put it into the value of this luminance, and then this luminance, we'll name this rock rough loom, disp loom, so that we know that that is the luminance value for this rock rough displacement. So I'll take this out color, this out value, I mean, definitely not out color. Take this out value and then put it into the displacement node there. And then what I'll do is I'll hit 1 just to shrink it. And then for rock rough levels, I'll hit 1 to shrink it as well. So it's just a little bit cleaner. They're just like together like that. Okay. Now, whenever I select rock rough levels, it'll show up in my attributes over here. And one thing that I can do is I can turn on render debug shading again, go to basic, turn on basic rendering, and let me actually hit isolate select. So you can see now I have the levels selected. You remember whenever you can go around and click, or you can isolate those sections. I'm going to isolate the displacement broad and the levels for that broad, because I want to take down those big areas. So the black areas go in, the white areas go out. So this is the black, this is the white areas. So I want to bring down the white areas. So I'll go to, instead of a value of 1, let's do a value of 0.8. See, it's starting to bring it in. 0.3. And let me do a update. Now you see it brought it all in. So let me turn off the isolate selection and turn off this crop region. And let's do update full. And that is way too much. Let me turn on smooth step as well. All right, let's start bringing this up. Let's do 0.7. See what that does. Let me see. I think that the scale is probably a little bit too big. So let's do 0.8. I want kind of like a big sweeping rock. Okay, let me go back to the rock levels. Let's see what it looks like at 1 now, since I changed the scale, because that was like a little bit too big. There we go. Actually, this is like a lot closer to the frequency I wanted. Might even want to put it out further to 1.3. All right, cool. This is actually pretty close to what I wanted. So, you know, you just eyeball it to whatever looks good with what you're doing. Okay, so if let me pause the render real quick. Look at the direct diffuse, indirect diffuse, the specular, and the specular indirect. All right. Now, since the dirt is so close to the color of the rock, it's kind of hard to see where it's mixing. So let me change the color of the mud so that it's like very apparent about what's going on. So I will make a AI color correct node. Okay. And I'm going to put this color correct node, I'm going to take my mud diffuse, put it into the input, and I'm going to take the AI color correct out color and put it into the base color. Okay, and then I'm just going to hit 1 to shrink that color correct node down. And now that I have my AI selected, I'll turn on the render again. And then let's start messing with the saturation. So I'll do like 1.2. You can see it changed a little bit. Saturation. Gamma this down a little bit. Make it kind of a darker mud color. .7. .6. All right. Now you can see there's like a huge difference between the rock and the dirt. And now we'll be able to tell where that range is happening a lot easier. So I'm going to go into my ramp. So remember, the ramp is that what's mixing the rock to the dirt. So I'll go into the ramp. So the displacement height, this thing is going to change the height of where it starts, and the ramp is going to change the like kind of how intense that mixture is. So it's either, and it does change the height as well, because all the 3D placement node is mapping this 0, 1 range black and white map. So if you change the values of this, it is, and ultimately it's going to change the height as well, because it's, you know, kind of remapping that area. So what I want to do is have like, you know, almost like a full value down here, and then it just gradates up. So that way, whenever I select this rock and move it, it has no mud on it until I go down into the mud. See? It just allows you to like have, I mean, this is not necessary. I mean, you can just do it by hand if you wanted to, but this is like a quick way to like get grounding on a bunch of rocks and stuff that you're making. It's just like a cool way to do it. Okay. So this video is really long, so I'm just going to stop it here. And so you can kind of, I mean, this has gotten you far enough, at least so you can start figuring out how to mix two texture materials together, this rock and this dirt. We can go much further and start mixing in different maps to break up that ramp value, this ramp value. You could actually run like different textures into it so that it, you know, starts taking in some values from the rock as well. Like we could take this displacement broad and actually mix it into this projection, so that they like kind of are like, having different areas of mud that's traveling in it. All right, so that is it for this video, and I can go a little bit more in depth in a later video on how to integrate some water lines and things like that. But so for the next video, we're going to go over subsurface scattering. All right, see you in the next one.